folks, welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I'm your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. This podcast is one for curious folks who enjoy learning about the history of traditions, folk tales, mythologies, folk art, and culture. We enjoy watching the pageantry of folklore, but really, this podcast is about pulling the curtains back to see how and why it all works. As an example, there is a tradition in Denmark that happens on one's 25th birthday if the person hasn't yet settled down with a partner. It harkens to the day of traveling salesmen, specifically the spice salesman, because they weren't ever in one place long enough to have a partner. And so they were often called pepper dudes, where single women are called pepper maidens. And the tradition of covering your family and friends in spices and water to help the spice adhere is said to be very good-hearted and judgment-free, as Danes don't usually marry early. And although learning about traditions such as this one is great for your next dinner party conversation, the heart of this podcast is not just to learn cool stuff, but to find common ground. The world we live in sometimes feels so divided. But when we learn things that make us unique and also that set us apart, but also that are alike, we find common ground. We discover that we are all just human and worthy of respect and love. So if that sounds like a podcast that you want to follow, make sure you hit that subscribe button, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform. Hit that subscribe button so that you get notifications every week when our podcast drops. And if you are a longtime listener, please consider giving us stars and writing a review, because that helps new people to find our show. So we have a really fantastic guest for you today and show. Melanie Kirkpatrick is a writer and senior fellow at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. She had a long career at the Wall Street Journal and is the author of several books, including the one we're going to be talking about today, Thanksgiving, the Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience. Our show is about what some call the America's favorite holiday, Thanksgiving. We'll be diving into its histories, inaccuracies, controversies, and how it became the holiday we all know and love. So thank you so much for joining us, Melanie.
It's wonderful to be with you, Vanessa. And yes, Thanksgiving is both full of lots of cool stuff in its history, and there certainly is common ground.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you began on this journey of writing this story of the history of Thanksgiving?
Sure. It was just after September 11th, and I was downtown on that terrible day in front of the World Trade Center, and had, of course, many upsetting memories of that day. But also, I got to thinking after September 11th, what does it mean for America? So many Americans, after Thanksgiving, after September 11th, began thinking about what it meant to be an American. And as Thanksgiving approached in November, I decided to read William Bradford's. He was the governor of Plymouth Plantation, and I decided to read his description of what has come to be called the first Thanksgiving. And to my surprise, it really resonated with Thanksgiving that we celebrate today, the idea of family and friends coming together to feast and enjoy one another's company, and of course also to reflect on our many blessings. So, and interesting though, Vanessa, it was so interesting that he did not use the word Thanksgiving. This was not a Thanksgiving for the Pilgrims. That designation wasn't used until a couple of years later, when Bradford called a Thanksgiving to celebrate the end of a harvest. To celebrate the end of a drought that had affected their harvest. So the rain fell, and he wanted it to gather everybody together to give thanks for the rain.
And it was in that same, is it a book, the William Bradford, is it a book that he
Yes,
talks about this?
it's a famous book. It's called Of Plymouth Plantation, and
Okay.
it's Bradford's history, his recollections of the whole pilgrim journey, starting in England and going through, their trip on the Mayflower, their arrival in the New World, and then for a couple of decades, their experience in the New World. It's a fabulous book, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a little hard going at times, but you can pick and choose the sections that you like. And another thing that's really interesting about this book, and it says something about American Thanksgiving traditions. There were aspects of the book that survived, from the beginning, but during the Revolutionary War, um, many pages went missing, and
Mm.
years later, in the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, those pages were discovered in London. And when they were discovered and published in America, it became a huge sensation. And Thanksgiving was part of those missing pages that were rediscovered in the middle of the 19th century. And that's one of the reasons, not the only one, but it's one of the reasons that the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians became associated with the holiday. Americans had been celebrating Thanksgiving for a couple of centuries before the Pilgrims were made part of the celebration.
Oh, well, how is that? I then I don't seem to understand the how are they celebrating it prior?
Oh, how were Americans celebrating Pride? Well, there's a long history of people giving thanks, both the Native American tradition, but in this case,
Mm.
mostly the European Christian tradition, which is based in part on the Jewish tradition of giving thanks around harvest time. And
Oh.
well, one of the chapters in my book talk about the Thanksgivings that took place before the landing of the Pilgrims in the New World,
Mm-hmm.
and there were previous European and Native American Thanksgivings in Florida and in Texas. And Virginia, and sometimes people, around Thanksgiving time, will in Texas or Virginia or Florida might say, that, we had the first Thanksgiving, not the Pilgrims and the Native Americans in Massachusetts. But that tradition, that religious tradition, persisted after, not just when the Pilgrims arrived, but it persisted for many years. And there is still a strong religious aspect to Thanksgiving if one wishes to adhere to it. But people give thanks on Thanksgiving Day. And to whom do they give thanks? They give thanks to a creator. There's one poll of Americans' practices on Thanksgiving Day that shows that if a family is likely to say grace before a meal, they do so on Thanksgiving Day.
Hmm.
But that's
So
just one of the traditions of the holiday.
so did the English pilgrims before they came over, was that something that they would do as well? Like around harvest time, would they have
Hmm.
a Thanksgiving type meal as well?
Yes, you're exactly right. There was a tradition of celebrating the harvest with a big meal after all the harvest had been gathered in. So that's another feature of the holiday when
Mm-hmm.
people would gather to eat a big feast and prepare for winter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to your book a little bit. At one point in the very beginning of your book, you talk about how you were asked to come to a classroom of students,
Uh,
and they were specifically most of them were immigrant students. Is that right?
Yes,
And
all of them were immigrants.
all of them.
There's a high school in New York City called Newcomers High School, and I had the great pleasure of visiting them. It's in Queens, and I had the great pleasure of visiting in a couple of about a week or so before Thanksgiving a few years ago. And High School is for immigrant kids. And they study the regular New York City public school curriculum, and they
Mm,
also get help with English. And so there's a strong ESL, English as a second language component to it.
mhm,
And a history teacher and an ESL teacher felt very strongly that as Thanksgiving approached, that their students should know about this tradition. So one of the things they did was invite me to come and talk about it. Well, I could hardly get a word in edgewise. These kids were so excited about the prospect of celebrating what for most of them would be their first Thanksgiving. And it was uh, it was fun. I asked whether you had to have turkey in order to celebrate. They all said yes, yes, yes. It's the tradition. But it was the serious aspects of it that had an impact on me. One boy who came from Tibet, which is now a part of China, but it's a country that it hasn't existed in more than half a century. He said his family came to America because they were persecuted as Tibetan Buddhists and followers of the Dalai Lama. So he said, I am like the pilgrims. I came here to practice my religion. And then a girl spoke up, and she was from Egypt, where her family were Copts, which is an early form of Christianity, and it's a
mm,
small minority in Egypt. And she said the same thing, that her family had been persecuted in Egypt, and they moved to America in order to practice their faith freely.
mm,
So my point is that the kids took Thanksgiving very seriously. It wasn't for them just about the food
mm,
or getting a day off from school. The significance of it in their minds was intense. And
mhm,
if you look at our history dating back to the 19th century, when large immigrants started coming in, waves of people from a range of countries, Thanksgiving has long been a kind of rite of passage for immigrants. It's a way for them to express their
mm.
allegiance to their new country.
That's so, when I was reading that part in your book, I just found that so touching that they really, connected with that so much because, they had such similar experiences that it really felt made them feel uh, connected to the country that they decided to live in. So I really enjoyed that part. Um, where did you? I was looking when I was looking through your book. There is your index is incredibly long, so it's obvious that you did a ton of research. But how did you accomplish all your research? What did you? What were your resources?
Well, that's a great question, Vanessa. It's going to be hard to answer because there were so many
Yes.
threads that I pursued. But as a journalist, even though I was writing about history, I took what I think is a journalistic approach. And I spoke to people who were experts in whatever period or issue I was talking about. I tried to go to primary sources as
Mm,
opposed to just secondary sources. So, for example, I would read the Thanksgiving proclamations of the presidents and the proclamations of governors. And then I spent a lot of time with Godey's Ladies book, which was the most popular magazine of the pre-Civil War era in America. And it was edited by Sarah Josepha Hale, who is known as the godmother of Thanksgiving. And it was she who uh, persuaded Lincoln to call the first in the series of national Thanksgivings. Before that, uh, uh, governors were the ones who would call the thing name decide and call on their citizens to celebrate Thanksgiving, and that
mm,
Thanksgiving Day could take place anytime from September to December. But after
mm,
Lincoln, we all came together on a date named by the president. So that's the kind of thing I researched. It was
mm,
more library work than I was used to as a journalist. It kind of took me back to writing my thesis in college, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then there were other chapters, such as the chapter on how Native Americans celebrate Thanksgiving today, that required more journalism. And I interviewed leaders in Native American communities around the country, for example.
Mm.
So,
Well, I mean, it's obviously you did so much research. Can you for those of our listeners who are not from America, can you give us a brief rundown of what Thanksgiving is and what it's about?
I wrote a whole book about it, so to give you a brief rundown isn't easy. But Thanksgiving is a holiday in America where families and friends come together to eat a traditional meal where usually roast turkey is the star, but there are other Native American foods that are usually included in the meal, such as potatoes and corn and squash. And but it, the idea is that Americans stop and take a moment to reflect
Mm,
on the good things in our lives and the blessings, our blessings as a nation. Sarah Hale considered Thanksgiving to be a kind of quasi patriotic holiday on the same level as the 4th of July, Independence Day, and George Washington's birthday. Um, and it's also a time when Americans, and this is a very long tradition from almost the beginning, Americans step back and think about the less fortunate among us.
mm,
Lots of Thanksgiving traditions have to do with helping people who are poor or in prison or alone. One of the saddest images in America is in American culture is somebody who's alone on Thanksgiving Day. So there are many community organizations and churches and synagogues that will offer Thanksgiving dinners for people who are alone or who are in need. It's and then there's a whole modern tradition that started just a few years ago, and I write about it in thanks my book is called Giving Tuesday, when
mm,
it comes after Black Friday, which is a shopping day, and Giving Tuesday is a day when Americans are encouraged to make donations to nonprofit organizations that they support. And so those are two of the things I associate with Thanksgiving.
mhm.
That wasn't so brief, but
Well, no, that's
that
great.
maybe helps.
Um, so the first Thanksgiving has some controversy, and it that was first brought to my attention when the book "Lies My Teacher Told Me" came out, and
Uh-huh.
I believe there was controversy around whether or not it was a true story or if it was just a myth that we had told ourselves or people had told Americans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanksgiving, the fact that Pilgrims and Native Americans came together in the fall of 1621 and had a harvest feast is true.
Mhm,
And there's really no question about that. It was a 3-day feast. The Native Americans brought a bunch of venison, of deer, to contribute to the meal. And but the thing that was missing for many years was the contributions of the Native Americans. The focus in schools has, and I'm speaking broadly here, generally,
mhm,
this may not be the case everywhere, but the focus has been on the English settlers, that is, on the pilgrims.
mhm,
Whereas, and sometimes making them out to be charitable to the Indians, when in fact
mm,
it was the Native Americans, the members of the Wampanoag Confederation, who made it possible for the Pilgrims to survive. Without
mhm,
their help, I don't think the Pilgrims would have survived. Half of the people who were on the Mayflower died before Thanksgiving, the first
Mm.
Thanksgiving took place. It was such a rugged winter. Um, and the Indians helped them they taught them how to plant traditional crops, native
Mm.
crops, and they led them to good fishing holes. And it was, and for about 50 years, the English and the Native Americans were at peace. Uh,
Mm.
and then um, Ki- King Philip's War erupted, and the uh, the violence really became quite awful, and eventually the English won. And I will say that the violence was on both sides, not just
Mm.
Native American and not just English. So,
Mhm.
uh, um, but I think today, from what I can tell, if schools teach Thanksgiving, which, believe it or not, doesn't happen very often, but if
Mm.
they teach it, if they teach the history, the history is more accurate and more balanced. That said, there are things that little kids do, like in kindergarten class or something, but they'll make Indian headdresses,
Mhm.
which is totally wrong because the Wampanoans, the New England Indians, didn't wear great big headdresses. That was something that came later when Americans went west and encountered the plains, the Indian tribes.
Oh, okay. How do you know the traditional dress of the Wampanoans?
I don't know it in detail. I think it might have included one feather, a single feather or something. But
Mhm.
obviously, it's a cold climate, so they had to wear animal skins and that sort of thing. And the
Mhm.
pilgrims, that's another thing. We do know what English people of that era wore, and they wore bright colors. Yet in our mind, pilgrims are dressed in gray with big buckles on their
Yeah.
hats. And so that was a revelation to me.
Yes, because I always thought the Pilgrims wore black and white,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they didn't.
no,
Uh,
no,
Interesting. Do we have any accounts from the Native Americans who were
no,
at the feast? Just
no. They,
the.
they were not literate, so
Mhm.
nothing that could come down to us that way. But there were accounts by individual pilgrims of their interactions with Native Americans when they first got to the New World. And so there are accounts from their point of view about their
Mhm.
traditions and all of that.
What were the foods that were new to the Pilgrims that they hadn't encountered in England
Oh,
that
that's
were brought to
interesting.
the natives?
Um, well, one food was potato. Um, Potatoes came from, I think, South America. I'm a little rusty
Mhm.
on my memory of this, but they were beginning to take off in England, but it's unlikely they would have encountered them because they were just among richer people, potatoes. Cranberries
Mhm.
certainly were new, and there
Mm.
were lots of cranberries growing in New England, in Massachusetts, where they were. The Native Americans used cranberries in their cooking. Pumpkins were new to them too, and
Mhm.
one traditional dish from the Native Americans was a hollowed out pumpkin that they'd stuff with stuff like cranberries. So
Mm.
corn was new to them, squash was new to them. Uh, so interestingly enough, we always associate, at least I do, apple pie with
Mhm.
Thanksgiving, but they couldn't have had apple pie or any pie for that matter because apples were brought to the United States from Europeans later in the 17th century. So we didn't have
Oh.
apples growing natively in North America. Similarly, you'd have to have wheat and sugar in order to make a pie.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, those were probably not available. They would have had to
Mm-hmm.
been imported on the Mayflower with the Pilgrims, and it's unlikely that happened.
What were the pilgrims' diet like if they were not eating? I mean, I guess you did say that the natives were helping them plant
Yes,
the native plants, but prior to that, what were they eating?
a lot of hunting and fishing.
Mm.
Um, it's very possible that turkey was on the menu at the first Thanksgiving because Bradford, I think it was Bradford, one of the pilgrims mentions wild turkeys in his description of the feast. But they shot and ate anything that moved. They'd eat eagles, for example. They certainly ate venison, and as I mentioned earlier, the Native Americans brought venison with them as a gift for for the feast. So, and then um, uh, their first year of planting was quite unsuccessful, and uh, even though they had had help from Native Americans on how to grow, what to grow, and how to grow it, but eventually, obviously, they learned to be better farmers,
Mm.
and and some of the traditions, though, of the food traditions, date back more likely to the late 18th century, and here my research included newspapers because there was the Hartford Courant, which is still publishing, by the way, in the late 18th century, had a marvelous description of the number of pies that were going to be eaten on Thanksgiving Day. And um, also, the first American cookbook came out around 1800, and that was the first time that um, there was a cookbook devoted especially to foods that were found in what became the United States and how to cook them.
Interesting.
So, corn, of course, played a big role in
Mm-hmm.
in the cuisine. So,
What were there any interesting pies that we might not have today that were eaten then?
yes, gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was a lemon apple pie, which I
Hmm.
had never heard of, and still haven't made. So maybe this
Yeah.
year I will do that.
Is that one of the recipes? I know that in your book you list some recipes. Was that one of the recipes that you listed?
No, I don't have a recipe for that, but there are lots of
Interesting.
others. That's an interesting story, Vanessa. My husband would say to me, "This is a book about Thanksgiving. You have to include recipes." And I said,
Mm.
"No, no, no. This is a serious book. It's not a cookbook. It's a history." But as I got into it, I realized my husband was right that the food traditions have a rich history as well,
Mhm.
and so I decided to include a section at the end of the book called Historic Recipes and Bills of Fare. So there are recipes, for example, from that first American cookbook I mentioned,
Mhm.
and then going forward into the 20th century. Believe it or not, oysters used to be part of a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, for example. They were very plentiful on both the East and the West
Mm.
coasts. So in the early 20th century, oyster stuffing was very commonplace. Now, today, oysters are much more expensive and
Mhm.
as not as easily found as they
Mhm.
used to be. Uh,
But that was a common dish. I think like oyster pie is common, or at least at one point was common in England,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yeah, yeah, I think so.
Mhm.
So, but
I remember I know this because I read a lot of the Outlander books, and one of them was
Yeah,
took place in England, and um afterwards I was like, what does oyster pie
what is
taste like?
this?
So I made it.
Oh, was
My
it?
kids were my kids were not a huge fan,
No,
but
no.
I thought it was okay.
Well, one thing to remember in our age of affluence is that it really wasn't until recently that Americans had the wealth to be able to
Mm,
vary their diet very much. So, people looked forward to Thanksgiving because of the abundance of food
mm-hmm,
and the baking and the preparations went on for days. Um,
mm-hmm,
Sarah Josepha Hale, the godmother of Thanksgiving, whom I mentioned earlier, early in her career, wrote a book in 1827, and one chapter in the book is devoted to a description of a traditional Thanksgiving dinner in New England. And oh my goodness, you couldn't believe the amount of food. There wasn't just a turkey, there was a roast beef and a roast pork. And the number of pies was incalculable. So, um,
but I'm sure they didn't let that food go to waste. I'm sure they just continued to eat it, unlike a lot of Americans today who ended up throwing it out.
right, absolutely.
Interesting. So I did want to ask about cranberries because cranberries are incredibly tart without sugar. Do they
Yes.
have access to sugar?
No, no, they did not. And it, it, it was, it was something they almost certainly did not bring with them on the Mayflower because it
Mm-hmm.
was a luxury food. So if they ate cranberries, it was probably not individually. So if you eat a cranberry, it's so sour you don't want to eat a second one.
Mm-hmm.
But if you
Yeah.
mix it with stuff like squash or whatever, which the Indians did, then it was
Mm-hmm.
more palatable. So if they ate it, I think that's probably the way they did.
And I know that Native Americans used maple syrup as well, so maybe they had some access to
Maybe,
that as
yeah,
well.
that's possible. Mhm.
Um, okay, so let's talk about how it became a national holiday. In your book, you mentioned a Supreme Court ruling. That was one of the first steps. Is that right?
No, no, not a Supreme
Okay.
Court ruling. It was under the Constitution. There was
Okay.
a debate about whether the president had the authority to call a Thanksgiving Day. Um,
Mm,
it says in the Constitution that all powers that are not designated to the president are to be assumed by the states. And so George Washington,
mm,
his first act as president, they issued a Thanksgiving proclamation. But in order to get around this constitutional issue, he did something very smart. Instead of just saying, I'm George Washington, this is when Thanksgiving will take place. And he could have done that because he was
mhm,
so popular.
mhm,
Instead, he wrote his proclamation and he sent a copy to every governor in each of the 13 states and said, please proclaim Thanksgiving in your state. And of course, they did so. So you got around that issue of constitutionality of it. When Sarah Hale, the editor of Godey's book, Ladies Godey's book, came on the scene, she started her campaign for a national Thanksgiving in the 1840s. And she would publish editorials and articles in Godey's Ladies book, which had a huge circulation for the day and was one of the first national magazines. Um, uh, uh, but to get around, she didn't offer, and at first she didn't offer a solution to this constitutional problem. But in addition to the articles she wrote, she had a private correspondence with important people of the day, what we would call influencers. She wrote to
mhm.
congressmen, she wrote to governors, she wrote to cultural figures, and she wrote to presidents. And because she was so famous, the presidents wrote back to her.
Mm.
And we have the correspondence, letters that she received from several presidents declining to issue a Thanksgiving Day, and the issue is for the reason is the constitutional issue, but also sometimes the issue of religion would be raised, and
Mm.
the president would say, well, no, that's a religious issue. We shouldn't get into that. Um, but now, where was I? So finally, she wrote to Lincoln in the middle
Mm.
of the Civil War, just shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, which
Mhm.
was a terrible thing where so many
Mhm.
Americans on both sides of the conflict died. And Lincoln took her up on this idea. And if you read his Thanksgiving proclamation, it's um, it's really a look at what America is going to be after the war ended. He didn't dwell on battles or death or even the horrors of war. Instead, he begins his proclamation by saying, let's see if I can quote that. The opening sentence was, "The year that is drawing toward its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and beautiful skies." Fruitful
Mm.
fields and beautiful skies. But of course, Americans would have been thinking about nothing but war.
Mhm.
Every family was impacted on both
Mhm.
sides, was impacted by war. And then he goes on to catalog the blessings for which Americans should be thankful. And finally, he asks Americans, both North and South, all Americans, to come together with one heart and one voice. I love that phrase.
Mm.
It's a beautiful image. And I must say, in our uh, uh, era of and our divided culture, I think this idea, this concept of one heart and one voice is something we all should strive for.
Mhm. And so how did he get around the
Oh,
constitutional?
he just did it. He just
He just did it.
he just did it. And if he had been challenged, I think he would have lost. But he set the scene, and every president since Lincoln, did so. And after Lincoln, though, Hale began to realize that this wasn't such a good idea to ask. It was a laborious process if the president had to name a date and then every governor had to agree and issue his own proclamation. So she proposed that Congress establish the date by law. And that unfortunately didn't happen until
Mm.
1941 when Congress there was a resolution in Congress and the holiday was made official.
So it wasn't the first holiday that was made by Congress.
Well, Congress had already named, I think Christmas was named in the 1870s. And of course, there
Uh-huh.
was Washington's birthday and Independence Day. But this
Okay.
was the first time, even though Thanksgiving had been celebrated for all of these decades, it was the
Mhm.
first time it was official that it was an American holiday that was celebrated nationwide.
And would you say it's the longest running tradition
It's
in
certainly the
America?
longest running tradition
Mhm.
in our history.
So that is so fascinating. I had no idea that it took so long for it to actually become a national holiday.
Yeah.
I just assumed that it had been a national holiday for, you know, forever.
Well,
But
I'll tell you.
1941 wasn't that long ago.
That's right. I'll tell you a personal story about that. But the impetus for Congress to do this was a controversy that President Franklin Roosevelt ignited. In the late 30s, he decided to change the traditional date of Thanksgiving. And he announced that he was uh, going to proclaim a National Thanksgiving Day earlier in November. And the reason he gave, it was not a very smart one, was that he thought that it was the Great Depression, and he thought that if Americans had an extra week or so of time to go Christmas shopping, that they'd spend more money and the economy would get a boost.
Mm.
But Americans didn't have any money to spend. So
Yeah.
this idea collapsed. However, it created a real controversy with the result that about half of the states stuck with the traditional date of Thanksgiving,
Mm.
and the other half of the state went with the date that Roosevelt had promulgated. But this is one, I like this part. Texas decided to celebrate both, so which uh, was very
You know,
uh,
why not?
why not? So it was because of this controversy that put pressure on Congress to,
Mm.
let's settle this once and for
Yeah.
all. And so the first official Thanksgiving was in 1942.
Okay. And um also Thomas Jefferson had a complicated relationship with Thanksgiving as well. Is that right?
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson, when he was governor of Virginia, was did proclaim a Thanksgiving Day.
Mm-hmm.
But when he became president and was asked to name a Thanksgiving Day, he declined for the constitutional reasons I mentioned earlier. And he
Mm-hmm.
wrote about them in a very eloquent letter to a minister who had written him, asking him to celebrate the holiday.
Mm-hmm. And so why did he why is it would you say it is associated with religion, because I feel like today it doesn't feel that way.
Mm, I think it depends who you are.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly compared to the past, it doesn't feel religious. Um, People used to go to church in recent memory, on Thanksgiving Day itself. Today, if a church may, you know, uh, mention Thanksgiving on the Sunday before the holiday, or
Mm-hmm.
even have a special service. Unified services became popular in around the turn of the 20th century, where different denominations would come together and have one service. But
Mm.
the real um, it's religious, on a case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly it's not associated with any religion,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's completely non-sectarian
Mm-hmm.
in that respect. But um, it's about giving thanks, and for I would say a majority of Americans, uh, giving thanks means giving thanks to God.
Mm-hmm.
So, however one defines the divine,
Mm-hmm.
so it becomes religious in that aspect. In that sense, it's very uniquely American.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that people of all faiths and of none can mark the holiday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always what I felt like, because in schools have to be careful around Christmas time, even though it's widely celebrated among Americans, but not everyone celebrates.
Mm,
No, not everyone is a Christian, and so schools have to kind of be a little bit more cautious. But Thanksgiving doesn't have that feeling, at least in my experience, where you have to
yeah,
tiptoe around making sure everyone feels that it's acceptable to
yeah.
their
There,
religious beliefs.
there is Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, don't celebrate Thanksgiving,
Oh, well, that would make sense. Yeah.
and I think there's another religion that may not. But it really
Hmm.
it's near universal.
Can you talk a little bit about the day of mourning that was started in the
Sure.
70s? Is that right?
It was in the 1970s when there were lots of civil unrest in America
Mhm.
and lots of demonstrations. And a group of Indians, not from New England, but from the West, decided that they were going to protest Thanksgiving in Plymouth, where, of course, the Pilgrims and Wampanoans celebrated the first Thanksgiving Day.
Mhm.
And since then, a group, usually a small group of people, gather in Plymouth to protest the holiday. And they then conclude with a feast, a group feast themselves. It hasn't really taken on in
Mhm.
I'm sorry, the Native American communities have not really taken this up. Um, and this became clear during the research I did and how Native Americans celebrate the holiday. And one leader I spoke to said, we are Americans. Of course, the holiday is
Mhm.
important to us, but we're also members of a individual tribe, and so we want to celebrate its traditions as well. So, my impression is that many, many Native Americans join in on the holiday, and it's
Mhm.
as important to them as it is to non Native Americans. It is a moment, though, I will say, to stop and reflect on the history of the indigenous people in our
Mhm.
country. And that's an important point to make. Um,
Mhm.
uh, was they played an extremely important role in helping to establish this tradition. But then, in subsequent years, we're faced with great violence and almost complete destruction of some tribes. So
Mhm.
it's appropriate to think back on that history as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. And do they have those tribes that do celebrate Thanksgiving? Do they have any special dishes that they do?
No, Venice, I don't know. And I was speaking not tribe by tribe. I was
Okay.
speaking more in individual people and making their
Mhm.
decision about whether to celebrate Thanksgiving. There's
Mhm.
certainly individual people, and a couple I can think of who were very eloquent on the subject of why they will not celebrate Thanksgiving.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
but in uh, I I mean, I didn't do a survey and I haven't read a survey that my strong impression is that Native Americans do tend to celebrate.
Mm. So let's talk a bit about the evolution of traditions at Thanksgiving. Obviously, there's the food that we've talked about, but there's also family games, football.
Ah,
Did the Pilgrims play games?
well, yes, they did. And one of the games that has been mentioned that they would have brought with them from England was taking a stick and a ball and kicking it around on the sand in Plymouth. So, and one person has said, "Oh, that means Thanksgiving football goes back to the first Thanksgiving." Well, I don't really think so. Football, as we know it today, began in the 1860s. The first game was played Rutgers versus Princeton. Rutgers won, and the first it was a trio of games, and Rutgers won. And not long thereafter, around 1870, um, Yale and Princeton began an annual tradition to have their championship game in New York City on Thanksgiving Day. And after that, Thanksgiving, that really sparked the tradition of
Mm.
Thanksgiving football. And football was taking off, and uh, colleges and high schools and community football leagues would have their championship game on Thanksgiving morning, and then go home to a wonderful dinner that the women in the family had stayed home
Right.
to cook. So, um, so yeah, football and Thanksgiving have gone together for a long time. And I'll mention that when Franklin Roosevelt named an earlier date for Thanksgiving, one of the biggest objections came from university presidents, and calendar makers, because they had all the calendars were, and at university, all the college calendars, timetables, had put Thanksgiving Day in the usual place, the last Thursday in November.
Hmm.
And uh, Roosevelt messed it all up. How were they going to be? They couldn't change the school calendar uh, at the last minute. So,
Hmm. It's interesting.
yeah, and
So when
then in the early 20th century, or late 19th, there were some religious objections you'd hear occasionally from devout people about how Thanksgiving uh, uh,
Mm,
football took away the meaning of Thanksgiving, and there was too much emphasis on it. And you certainly
mm-hmm.
hear it today. People say, turn off the TV. Not everybody wants to uh, focus on a little ball, but
Mm-hmm.
I think Thanksgiving football's here to stay. Yeah.
Probably. I'm from Texas, and it used to be a big thing for UT and A&M to have a Texas football game, a football game on Thanksgiving. But now they're in different districts, so
Oh,
it hasn't happened for years. But
oh,
it was the game that everyone watched.
yeah, that's a tradition in a lot of places. So,
Yeah,
and of course,
rival teams coming together.
and then there are three national NFL games on Thanksgiving Day. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
So when did there are other traditions that occur around it? You mentioned Black Friday, Giving Tuesday, and now there's Cyber Monday. How did those all start? When did Black Friday really rear its head?
Black Friday, I don't know the full history of it, but so I can't even. I might have researched it, but I'm sorry, I don't
Yeah,
remember exactly when it took hold. It has taken hold worldwide, by the way, Black
it
Friday.
has.
Lots of countries have it now without, and they don't celebrate Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
But um, I like Black Friday. A lot of people say to me, "Oh, it's a terrible thing after this beautiful Thanksgiving celebration to go out and be consumers." I understand that, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, the prosperity of our country enables Black Friday, and it also enables Americans to, if they wish, help poor people, or give money to charities. And Cyber Tuesday was established just about 10 or 15 years ago. It's a new holiday, a new,
Mm-hmm.
it's not really a holiday, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
As a way, definitely in response to Black Friday, the
Mm-hmm.
idea that let's shift the focus to uh, the charitable world.
Mm-hmm.
It's been successful. It's also traveled around the world. There are places in Europe and elsewhere that also mark Cyber Tuesday,
Giving Tuesday.
Giving Tuesday. Excuse
Yeah,
me.
Giving
Yeah,
Tuesday.
Cyber Monday.
Right.
Cyber Monday doesn't have anything to do with Thanksgiving. I think.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's just more connected with Black Friday, I think, because
Yeah.
people don't necessarily want to go out and yeah.
Right.
Um, and you also said that there's a tradition of giving to um, those who are in need. So, do you know when churches? I think it's primarily churches and soup kitchens that do this. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I think I know lots of people who volunteer. Not just, and they're not necessarily volunteering at churches, but the tradition. The first reference I could find of uh, Thanksgiving being associated with helping the less needy, the more needy. It was in a town in Massachusetts, Situate, Massachusetts, in, if my memory is correct, 1636.
Mm.
And there was a Thanksgiving, religious Thanksgiving um, service, after which everybody was invited to bring food, and especially um, they said to help feed those who were in need. Um, there's a chapter in my book about the tradition of helping the needy on Thanksgiving Day, and
Mm-hmm.
today, of course, uh, there are many ways that people do so, and try to make it possible for every American to have a Thanksgiving dinner, whether they're in prison. There's a big outreach to the prison population on
Mm-hmm.
Thanksgiving. Also, the military around the world have, wherever they're stationed, have a Thanksgiving dinner. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and as well as we've, of course, mentioned the needy, where there are lots of opportunities to help there. So, and it's with the needy, it's not just uh, um, kind of an impersonal handing over of money or whatever, or goods. In many Americans actually want to participate and sit around a table with less fortunate people, and have a meal together and conversation and
Mm-hmm.
all of that. And uh, it's, as I said earlier, I think one of the saddest images in our society, in our culture, is a lonely person on Thanksgiving Day.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful short story by O. Henry about that, an elderly gentleman who wants to help a homeless man by giving him a great meal. And I won't tell you what the twist is at the end, but O. Henry was famous for his twisty stories, and this one had a Thanksgiving twist to it.
Oh, well, now I need to read that.
Yeah.
So other places in the world, do they have? I know that Canadians have their own Canadian Thanksgiving, and it's on a separate day. I think it's in October, I
Yes, it
believe.
is. It's on Columbus Day weekend in America. So
Oh, okay.
it's the same holiday, but it's the same calendar day, but
Yeah.
different holidays. Yeah,
Do other countries also?
The Canadian Thanksgiving, it's not as meaningful in Canada as it is
Hmm.
here. Families and friends gather for a meal, but it's for sure. Uh, but it's not. It doesn't have the significance that the American
Hmm.
holiday has, because it doesn't have the history. One speculation about how it got started in Canada was that during the Revolutionary War, loyalists, that is, families who were loyal to the king, fled from the Boston area, would flee to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and so some speculation is that those people took the holiday with them to Canada, but
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
don't know.
And has it spread anywhere else?
Not the holiday itself that I'm aware of, except maybe Brazil. There was a Brazilian ambassador to the United States at the end of the 1940s who really became enamored of the holiday. And when he went home, he took the holiday with him. And I, uh, Brazil has some kind of Thanksgiving holiday, but I don't know how connected it is to the history of the
Mm-hmm.
American holiday.
The history. Um, and some people call it America's favorite holiday. Would you call it that?
Yeah, I think I would. It's uh, the response to my book has been would confirm that. So
Mm.
I've heard. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, "Oh, it's my favorite holiday." Um, The reasons, I think what people have told me is that they like it because it's not commercialized, uh,
Mm,
um, and they like it because it's a unifying holiday. It brings people
mm,
together, um, families and friends from afar. So, yeah, you know, Christmas is in the running too there. But
mm-hmm.
I would say, yes, maybe it is Americans' favorite holiday.
And did we miss anything? So I know we've covered quite a bit today, but do you feel like we've missed anything when we're talking about the
Well, I
importance?
guess the one thing I'd like to add, Vanessa, is that there is, in addition to the recipes that I include at the end of my book on Thanksgiving, I include readings for Thanksgiving Day. And
Mm,
lots of Americans have written about Thanksgivings over the centuries. And I know many families who take the opportunity to read something from a historical document such as Washington's proclamation, first proclamation about Thanksgiving, so that the family has an opportunity to reflect on it. And uh, I'd urge you to take a look at those readings because they kind of tell the history of America. I included readings during wartime, readings from famous American writers. There's even uh, I was able to find a quote by Winston Churchill during the Second World War about the American Thanksgiving. So it's a very it permeates our society, and in literature, in food, of course, in
mm-hmm,
religion, in immigration. It's just and it I think keeps evolving too. But at
mm-hmm,
its core is always the idea of taking time to sit back and think about the blessings in one's individual life, but also as um, uh, as a nation. And
mm.
so,
When you mentioned the readings, my family has never done that. The thing that we often do is go around the table and say something that we're thankful
yes,
for, which I
yes,
think is a common tradition in a lot of families. But I really love that reading around the table idea as well, because I do really think that it's important to remember, the history and the roots of where our traditions come from. And I think that you're right. It takes us back to what the purpose of the holiday is all
yes.
about.
I like to say sometimes that with us at our Thanksgiving table, no matter where we are the ghosts of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Sarah Josepha Hale. We should give thanks for the tradition that they helped to establish.
Oh, that brings me back to Josepha Hale. Is that her last name?
Yes.
Why was she so adamant? Like, what drove her to really push for this? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, she was a New Englander. She was from New Hampshire, and that's where a lot of the traditions of the holiday took hold.
Mm-hmm.
And she loved the holiday. She just really had a passion for it. But I I think what truly motivated her was that she was worried about America disintegrating. Her view was she was
Mm,
born as the Revolutionary War ended, and she took the view that while America had been united um, politically by the Revolutionary War, it was still divided culturally. And
mm-hmm.
when she uh, founded her magazine in 1828, she deliberately set out to help bring America together through culture. And she was she
Mm,
published only articles by American authors on American topics, which was new for the day. Editors used to steal articles from British publications or from American newspapers and republish it them in their magazines. So as there was a very divided politics in the 30s, 40s, 50s about the institution of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And she saw Thanksgiving as having a moral importance because it would bring Americans together. If you sat down together on the same day, no matter where you were in the country, it made you realize that you were all part of one country. And she hoped it would avoid civil war, help to avoid civil war. And of course, it didn't. But
Mm-hmm.
that was part of her motivation for promoting the holiday.
Well, I'm definitely going to give thanks for her this year because it is a wonderful holiday. And I definitely appreciate you coming on to talk to us about all this wonderful, rich history.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's been a pleasure. And let me be the first to wish you happy Thanksgiving.
You as well. And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on this thankful journey today at Fabric of Folklore. We will be listing all the links that, especially to her book and her website, but anything else that we can find that we've referenced, we'll link up on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. So you can find links to Melanie Kirkpatrick's book and then her other works as well. She's done several other really fascinating books as well. So what did you learn today about America's oldest official tradition? You can continue the conversation on our Facebook community group. It's called Fabric of Folklore Community. And we also encourage you to comment on our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed today's show, make sure you're liking, sharing, and commenting because that definitely helps us to be found. Sharing is caring. And consider writing us that review like I mentioned before. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you want to learn about. And we want to know that what you're taking from this show. So interacting with us is definitely desired. So thanks once again, for unraveling the mysteries of folklore. My name is Vanessa Y. Rogers. And until next time, keep the folk alive.